today, our webinar is a collaborative effort based on a SARE grant that was received between Masood Hashemi at UMass, Heather Darby at UVM, and of course Rick Kersbergen at UMaine. And they are looking at, they're doing research on a variety of different grazing season extension, alternative forages, and there's going to be some really interesting data coming down the pipeline for that soon too. And the administrative support today is also being provided by the New England Grazing Network and the Livestock Institute of Southern New England, which is a member of this newly created New England Grazing Network. So without further ado, and to give Rick the most time possible, I'm going to pass it over to him. A lot of our New England attendees probably already know Rick. He doesn't need much of an introduction, but we do have a few people with us from Virginia and the Midwest that I saw today. So Rick has been with UMaine for quite a while now. He has a very wide expertise in everything from, dairy on pasture and organic to soil health, alternative forages, animal forage ration balancing, and I'm really excited and grateful to have him as our speaker today. So I am going to now turn off myself and I am going to pass the ball over to Rick.
Thanks, Dan. I'm going to hopefully get my screen up. And how's that? Does that look all right for everybody?
Looks good.
All right. So again, I'm Rick Kersbergen and I work for University of Maine Cooperative Extension. And I'm going to talk about improving pastures with no-till methods. And probably almost everyone thinks I'm going to pull up some no-till drills right away, but I'm not going to start that way. But I also want to make sure that people have my contact information. And I'm partially retired now, so it's hard to get me on the phone, much easier to get me by email. So if you have questions that don't get answered today or want to follow up on anything, please don't hesitate to contact me at that email address, which is richard.kersbergen@maine.edu. So let's see if we can advance the slides here. So, when I'm talking about pasture improvement or pasture renovation or trying to figure out a problem on a farm, I'm always asking the producer, what are the questions you're trying to answer? What are your goals? What are you trying to make this field look like? How do you manage your fields? What kind of animals do you have? What are your future plans? What equipment do you have? All sorts of questions, because the answer to how to improve that field is going to be different depending on the producer, the equipment, all these questions and all these variables. So it's really important that there's no one answer fits everybody's situation. So it's really important to think about, what's the background information you're dealing with. And one of the things I like to always talk about is the fact that when you're talking about pasture management, it's not just saying, well, I want to have a field of timothy or I want to have a field of ryegrass, but it's normally thinking about how do I improve that pasture sward to be more diverse. So my animals will be having a variety of plants to choose from. And it's also in terms of, especially if you think about it this year, having a diverse sward of plants out there is really important because it builds resilience into the system. So if you were going to my house today and to look at my lawn, you'll see that I have only one thing growing, and the only thing green in my lawn right now are dandelions because they have a deep taproot. So by having a diversity of plants in my lawn, at least I have something green because we've had very little rain. But it's also important in terms of thinking about, the fact that if you've got a diverse architecture of plants out there, you're building a better solar collector, you're capturing more solar radiation, and you're building better ability for those animals to pick and choose and be able to provide really nutritious forage for your animals and a diversity of forages. So throughout this presentation, you're probably going to see slides that you may have seen before from other presenters, and this one's I stole from Sid Bosworth, who's a recently retired agronomist from University of Vermont. But when you're talking about trying to improve either a hayfield or a pasture, we've got to figure out what's the underlying problem. Why does it look bad? Why is it producing poorly? Is it a soil situation? Is it low fertility? Is it compaction? And you're saying, well, it's compaction, I've only got animals out there. But I'll show you a slide in a minute that shows that compaction can be a real problem in pastures. And that's not something that I usually thought about until recently. And then what about grazing? How are you managing that grazing? Are they undergrazing? Are they not grazing well enough? Are they giving too much pasture in each allocation, not enough? Is it a combination of factors? So look and try and figure out what's the problem. How did I get to this situation? And why do I have the plants that I have? And why do I have the productivity status that I have? So recently we did some work with Faye Benson from New York, and I never really thought about compaction being a problem in a pasture, but here's 2 soil samples that we dug out of a pasture in Freeport. And if we look at it saying which soil sample would you rather have your plants growing in, and most all of us would probably choose the one on the left. It's got better soil structure. You can see more roots in there. You've got more air and space there for water and air to infiltrate through. Where the sample on the right is definitely compacted. It's got a layer of near the surface that minimizes the ability for water to drain through that field, so it's going to hold water. It's going to create a poor system for those plants to grow in. So really what's interesting is these samples were taken in a pasture about 2 feet apart. And the only difference is the one on the left was underneath the fence line, and the one on the right was in the pasture itself. So just the pasture and the compaction from the animals walking on that field created that compaction layer. Not something I normally used to think about in terms of pastures, because usually when we think about compaction, we're always thinking about tractors and heavy equipment rolling on fields. A lot of the questions I saw on the chats, or the questions that were on the applications for this webinar, dealt with weeds and how do we deal with certain weeds. And we'll talk a little bit about it at the end. But then you've got to decide, well, is that weed a problem or not? Sometimes we think about weeds as always being a problem, whereas they may or may not be. What's the weed doing? Is it poisonous? Obviously, that's going to be a problem. Does it suppress desired species? Does it reduce the yield? Does it have some allelopathic effects, something like a knapweed would potentially? Is it unpalatable? Animals not eating it. Can you train those animals to eat it? Maybe it would be a productive plant in your pasture if you could get your animals to eat it. So let's start with the basics. So obviously the first thing I'm going to say is, you're going to start by looking at the underlying problem, getting a soil test. That's the first thing you should do whenever you think about trying to figure out what's going on in the pasture, where's the problem, and how do I start remediation. So I always say start with the easiest one. And so, my job a lot of times is pretty easy. I can sit back in a chair just like this. This is a picture of Tim Griffin when he was young and vibrant extension person in University of Maine. But, a lot of the times it always starts with the soil test and seeing that, most of these fields have not had many inputs into it, and especially adding any liming agents. So a lot of times the pH of the soil is low, and that's inhibiting the grass or desirable species you want to grow and allowing weeds that can be more tolerant of a more acidic soil to grow. And so some data from Dan Hudson, who used to be at UVM, showed that, soil tests that went to the UVM lab for hay and pasture in Vermont, approximately a third of them were significantly acidic, meaning that the pH was low. That's a huge amount of soil samples coming back that require lime. And a third were also low in other soil nutrients. But the real one I always want to start with is soil pH, because that's the one that, it's kind of the hidden situation that occurs. And it's probably one of those situations where investments in applications of liming agents are important. So here's just an example of fields. We used to keep fields up at our experiment station at certain pHs just to show people the effects. And so the sample on right is all the grass that came from a quadrat of a soil that was at a pH of 5.3, and the sample on the right is all the grass that came from that same size quadrat with a pH of 7.0. So the only difference here is the soil pH, and you can look at the amount of yield and the not just the volume of grass, but also the maturity of that grass and the tallness of the grass. So here's what the pH 5.3 looks like. And so, when we took that sample to get those grasses, we had to weed out, so to speak, all the weeds and undesirable plants to get that sample. So obviously with a pH of 5.3 versus a pH of 7.0, big difference in both yield and quality of the grasses. So, if this is the pasture or hay field you want to try and renovate, your first step is we need to change that soil pH. And, everybody says, well, what's the best time to apply that lime? And I say as soon as possible. So lime, calcium carbonate is the usual liming agent. There are other liming products out there, wood ashes, a variety of other things you can use as well. But you've got to realize that lime is an investment. So getting that soil to slowly change pH is critical to getting started in pasture renovation and pasture improvement. And so there were questions about how to find or get lime applied to your fields. There are commercial applicators in Maine. So if you need help finding somebody, I'm sure there are applicators in other states as well that do that for you. Or you can buy lime in bulk and try and spread it yourself. But I find that applying with a commercial applicator is probably the easiest and quickest way to do it. But realize that when you apply a liming agent to the soil, especially if you're going to do it in a no-till system, surface applying that lime does not automatically change that soil pH. It takes some time. So if you look at this slide, you can see that the lime was applied 0, 2 tons, or 4 tons per acre applied in 1986. So this is a relatively old study, but it's still pretty useful. You can see that it took several years before that soil pH change. And so it took 3 years for the 2 tons per acre to get up to a pH of about 6.3. And it took almost 4 years to get up to that pH of 7.0 with the 4 tons per acre. So when you're surface applying lime, it takes time for that change to occur. So realize that putting lime on and trying to see results the next year may or may not be as fruitful as you had hoped, but it's still an important investment you need to make in the future of the productivity of that field. So here's just some basics that we always think about in terms of seeding new forage species, whether it's using no-till methods or conventional till methods, is, get that soil fertility appropriate for what you want to grow. So again, most of our cool season grasses, and I'm going to spend a lot of time on that, cool season forages, is that, they like a fairly neutral pH of 6.5 to 7, especially legumes. If you want to have legumes, the higher pH is probably going to be more appropriate for them to grow in. Also, if you're going to be putting seed in the ground, whether you're going to be frost seeding, whether you're going to be just broadcasting, if you're going to be drilling, think about the time of year when that species is going to grow the most vigorously. So you need to think about cool season forages. They like to grow when it's cool and moist. So traditionally that is early spring or late summer. So trying to seed a cool season forage in the middle of July is not going to be very successful. You're going to be outcompeted by plants that do much better in hot, dry conditions, which are normally a variety of annual weeds. When you're seeding forages, you got to be at the right depth. Make sure that you find out where that seed is when you're seeding. Whether you're using a drill, however you're doing it, you need to have that seed at the right depth and have good soil to seed contact. So when that seed does germinate, that it's not going to dry out immediately. And then finally, especially with no-till systems, how do we compete against the existing forages that are in there? How do we compete against weeds, and how do we compete against the forages that are still growing and you want to just try and introduce new species or better species? So I'm going to try a variety of methods. One is thinking about, well, can you just use better grazing management to improve your pasture? So when you look at a pasture like this, it's got lots of weeds, it looks like it's dried up, lots of plants that have gone to seed. What caused that? Was it your pasture management that caused it? And is it undergrazing or is it overgrazing? Did you have too many animals in that acre, or did you have not enough animals in smaller acreages? And so think about that. And here's an old slide from 1986 that talks about what this is called the cycle of poverty in a grazing. I love this slide because it really gets back to how grazing management can really affect what your pastures look like. So whether it's either overgrazing or undergrazing, like that previous slide, what happens is that on both of those situations, you have selective grazing. You're going to get plants that are going to seed that are not desirable, and you're going to get species degradation. And weeds are going to start to infiltrate. You're going to have reduced animal products because the animals are not getting the nutrients they need from the forages that are out there, and potentially decreased stocking rate over time. And it's a continuous cycle that just causes that field to go downhill. Whereas if you think about trying to manage that grazing, so you make sure you have the optimum stocking rate, so you get non-selective grazing, meaning the animals are going to consume more of the forage, the desirable and maybe the undesirable. They're going to kind of force their hand, in a sense, to get better utilization. By that, you tend to see species that are more desirable have an equal competitive nature against the undesirable species. Potentially, you get a higher stocking rate and better quality feed coming over those pastures. over time, and potentially more animals and better pasture utilization. So here's just one system I look at. Here's a situation where we use sheep to take that pasture on the left, which is kind of weedy. You can see dandelion heads. It's pretty mature. But we put a huge amount of sheep in a small area for 2 days. And basically we force their hand. We force them to eat that all the way down. And so in this situation, we're trying to allow sunlight to hit the ground, potentially allow some legumes that would have been dormant in the soil to potentially germinate because they're being exposed to sunlight, and also try and put all the plants on equal footing in terms of competition. Now you have to be careful. You're not going to want to do this with highly productive animals. You're going to use animals that are potentially in a situation where they're at maintenance or they're not have a high nutrient demand. So it's not going to be used, in every situation. You're not going to use highly productive dairy cows in this type of situation because you don't want to impact their nutrient status when they're milking. But if you've got some animals at maintenance, like ewes in the summer that are not bred or getting just done lactating and you just wean their lambs, it'd be a good time to do that. But it's a good way to try and put all the plants on an even keel without having to mechanically harvest that feed to get it off. What are some other ways? Well, frost eating is one. And frost eating, I love this title and I wish I was responsible for it, but it's a Tim Griffin title. It's frost eating. It's either a low-tech wonder or wishful thinking, depending on whether it works or not. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to put seed out there at a time of year when the ground is freezing and thawing, and allowing that seed hopefully to hit soil and to potentially get into the soil through freezing and thawing. You need sufficient moisture. Again, you need to make sure the fertility is good, and you want to have limited competition, meaning that seed has to land on bare soil. If it's landing on thatch, it's not going to work. And so most of the time when we're doing frost eating, we're thinking about trying to get legumes established in a pasture, increase the legume content. And I thought I'd throw this out there because it's an interesting slide, because you're trying to figure out what's the legume competition or legume composition in these 3 samples. And this is from Ed Rayburn, but looking at that, it's hard to see the difference between some of these, especially the one that's 25% legume and 75% grass. That looks like a lot of legume to me, but it really isn't. And if you look at the one on the right, that's 46% legume. So some of it's based on the volume of material, not just the leaf surface. So again, I just thought that was an interesting slide. So frost eating works best when there is bare soil. A lot of times we're using legumes to do this. So red clover tends to be a real popular one because it's relatively cheap. And then you got to think about, how do I limit competition? Are you going to be able to put animals out there early on so they can graze the existing forage a little bit and let the new seeding of red clover come up through and get it some sunlight? So you need to think about how you're going to allow some of that competition to aid in the development of the newer species you're trying to get in. What about using your animals to seed pastures? So it's important to realize that, frost eating, we're thinking about freezing and thawing to get that seed into the ground. Maybe animals can put that seed in the ground for us as well. And so, there's potential ways to do this. How do we take, things like a waste area, maybe winter feeding yards, spread some seed out there and let animals, pound that seed into the ground or hoof it into the ground. And again, you can use managed grazing to do some of this when the soil is moist. Sometimes you can introduce other crops, especially in the fall, such as brassicas, and I think we'll have a webinar about introducing brassicas for fall grazing later this summer. But think about how you want to do that. So you can call it a hoof and tooth reseeding, whereas you can use your animals to try and kind of set back the existing forage, as well as introduce the new seeding and having them use their hooves to put that seed in the soil. And on the bottom picture on the right, you can see these situations might work well for where people have fed bales during the winter and have kind of bale grazed. And I'm at Wolf's Neck Farm today doing this webinar, and they were asking me about bale grazing here. And I was not very positive about that because Wolf's Neck Farm has heavy clay soils. And so it really is not set up for bale grazing. But if you have a fairly well-drained site, and you potentially could bale graze in the winter and use that as a reseeding tool or reseeding opportunity without having to provide tillage, it's a good opportunity. So let's talk about some other things in terms of no-till pastures and how to do that. Again, most of the time I'm going to be talking about the two bottom ones, about either new forage seedings or improving pasture or renovating hayfields or introducing new species into pastures or hayfields. So, we see increased use of no-till in a variety of ways. And as Samantha said early on, I've done a lot of work with no-till corn and seen the soil quality benefits from using no-till corn and cover crops. But, the benefits of no-till are we do see an increase in organic matter without that tillage operation. When we till soils, we burn off organic matter. We see better soil quality in terms of microbial activity, whether that's earthworms or better soil, stable aggregates. And hopefully we're also allowing for increased carbon sequestration. And some of the things we also see are soil moisture conservation, and obviously the easiest one, reduced field time and using less fuel for plowing, harrowing, and my favorite opportunity of picking rocks. So basics of no-till drills, if you're going to use these no-till drills to introduce new species, is you got to realize these are heavy pieces of machinery. And you're trying to get this seed into the ground at a very shallow depth. You want good soil to seed contact. And when you're looking at different drills, they're going to come in a variety of ways of doing that. Some of it's going to be based on the spacing of the seed dropping that's going to occur. Some of it's going to be based on how good the soil conditions are when you do it, if it's too dry or too wet. All those are important factors to think about. So again, just a big checklist, and one of the ones I need to think about is at the bottom, but again, we want to make sure we're managing that pH and getting that correct before we even start thinking about either renting or buying a drill. Think about how we're going to control the existing vegetation. You're going to do that with your animals, you're going to do it with mowing, and you're going to do it with herbicides. Picking the right time to do this, again, you want to emphasize the time you introduce those seeds are the times when they are going to grow the best, so they have some competitive advantage. Think about that soil to seed contact, the seed quality. How are you going to control vegetation after you've seeded? So again, trying to figure out how to minimize the competition from the existing forage. And then the other one is field smoothness. It's important to realize you're trying to get this seed in a depth of 1/4 of an inch deep in most situations. And if you've got a really bumpy field and you're going over it with these drills, trying to get that seed 1/4 inch deep on a uniform basis is going to be quite the challenge. So here's just an example of the fact that seeding depth is really important. Again, this is an older slide, but it shows that once you go past that 1/4 inch depth of this is a bird's-foot trefoil example, but once you go past that depth, you're really reducing potential yield and emergence of that seed. So if you're planting that seed at an inch deep, you've already reduced your yield by 50%. So that's a big consideration when you're using no-till drills. You need to get off the drill, look for that seed. It's not easy to find. You've got to look at where it is. And sometimes you've got to assume that when you see seed on the ground, you're probably getting things at the right depth, because most of that seed's only 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch deep. The other thing you want to think about is what are you putting in the ground? Again, most of the times we're talking about introducing legumes to try and improve the legume composition of that pasture. But you also want to think about, if you're introducing grasses, which grasses are going to potentially shade tolerant, because again, they're going to be in the shadows of the existing forage. So how do you pick those, and what are you going to pick? So here's just some examples, and this is from Virginia Cooperative Extension. So these are species of grasses and clovers that tend to be a little bit more shade tolerant. And on the right are some of the seeding rates you'd want to use, especially if you're going to try and drill in. So a variety of seeding rates, a variety of different grasses. And again, make sure that you're picking something that's going to be vigorous in the soils you have, as well as doing this at the right time of the season. So I just throw this out here because this is how we would traditionally seed forages on a plowed ground. We would plow, we would harrow, we would put our soil amendments on, we would seed with a brilliant seeder, try and get a firm seed bed, and try and get that seed in that 1/4 inch. Of course, I forgot about the picking rocks period, but again, it's one of those where we try and get a firm seed bed. And so this is what a firm seed would look like. If you walk across it and your feet go any deeper than that. See that footprint there? You've got too much of a fluffy seed bed and that seed's not going to grow. So the advantage of no-till seedings are that you're going to seed into something that's already compacted and firm. So I got a bunch of pictures from Kate Parsons from Massachusetts, and this is her no-till drill. And I like this drill for a variety of reasons. One of them is that it has very close spacing. So you'll find that most no-till drills have spacings of 6 inches, 7 inches apart for the seed drop, whereas these S drills have 4-inch spacing. So I'm going to go through some of the basics of this drill and show you some of the components that you need to look at if you're going to use one of these, whether you're going to buy it or rent it. So obviously the first thing that comes into the ground is that fluted coulter in the front. So that wavy coulter actually cuts a slice into the ground. And you can see here that it's cutting that slice probably 1 inch to 1.5 inches deep. And if you look to the left, you'll see that the next component are the double disc openers, which are 2 discs that are going right in that same slice and creating an opening in the soil. And those double disc openers are the real workhorse of this because they are creating that little bit of seed soil contact. They're going to create that opening for that seed to drop in. So this is kind of looking at it from the front. You've got the fluted coulters in the front, and then you can see the double disc openers behind that. What's really important to think about is, how do you get the right seeding rate? And so there's all sorts of gears, all sorts of ways to manage the seeding rate. And also on certain grain drills or certain no-till seeders, they're going to be large seed boxes and small seed boxes. And both of them may have adjustments in terms of how to get the right amount of seed dropped. So it's important to calibrate those seeders to make sure you're putting the right amount of seed on, as well as where you're putting that seed in the ground. So you want to follow the directions for calibration. There may be a chart, it's in the seed box, probably tells you how to set things for certain type seeds, but I still like jacking up a tire and turning that and collecting some seed to make sure I know exactly how much seed I'm putting out there. So it's really important to make sure you follow that and make sure that the settings you're at are appropriate. So get off the tractor, make sure that you're not using too much or too little seed, make sure that your calibration process was correct. And finally, after the double disc openers, you'll see that the seed drops down a tube and then there's a packing wheel behind it. And you can see with this seeder that we're talking about a 4-inch spacing, so it's pretty tight seeding. So a nice firm seed bed with that packing wheel. And again, you can see there's adjustments for how much tension is on those packing wheels. And you can adjust that for the types of soil conditions you have. And this is what you're looking at. You're looking at a nice firm seed bed in the center where that packing wheel is pressed down, and hopefully that seed is only 1/4 to 1/2 inch deep. So getting off, looking, and checking is important. Here's another type of drill that a lot of farmers have tried in Maine, some with success and some without, and this is an Atchison drill. It's a little bit different in that it has a coulter in the front. It's just a single disc, and it's followed by a shoe that creates an opening with the seed dropping in, and there's no real packing wheel, just the action of the shoe. The reason I like these drills is that the seed delivery system is a sponge type system. And so with the other no-till drills, if you were seeding both a clover and a grass, or a grain and a clover, a mixture of seeds, you find that as you're bouncing along the field that those seeds tend to separate, and you may have a lot more grass coming out versus clover, or more clover coming out versus grass, depending on how those seeds kind of fall out during the process of seeding. Whereas the sponge applicator, the seed delivery for different size seeds is much more uniform. And so it works really well. The one drawback is that mice really like those sponges, so I suggest taking them out every winter, otherwise you're not going to have much of a seeder. So that's the shoe that you would follow through with. It's really important to suppress the sod. It's just whether you're going to do that with a herbicide or some other method, it's important to do that. Just some yield differences that show that with sod suppression, you get much higher % stand. You can do that with animals. You can do that with frequent mowing. You can do it with herbicides, a variety of ways, but realize you've got to try and find a way to get that competition. So here's just some pictures. We tried trying to seed some winter grains into an existing sod in the fall. We did one side with tillage. You can see that on the right. The other side we did by bush hogging and scalping the field and no-till drilling. And you can see that the scalped with no-till drill, you can see those winter grains coming through, but they are really competing against the existing sod. A lot of times after an annual crop, it helps to no-till. Here's just some slides of alfalfa established in the fall after corn silage harvest. Another technique being used is to grow a winter grain, take that winter grain off and come through and no-till drill your perennial sod into that winter grain. Tom Kilser's done some work with this in New York and been very successful, again, in terms of drilling into the stubble left over from the winter grain. And again, you don't want this type of situation where you're going through with your no-till drill, seeding way too deep, creating too much soil disturbance. Again, these are heavy pieces of machinery. You've got to make sure that you're still putting that seed a 1/4 inch deep so we can have some failures depending on what's going on. And then weeds, how do we deal with those weeds? How do we deal with the problems they're creating? How do we get them to not compete our desirable forages? So there's a whole webinar we could do just on weeds, but this is an old survey from 10 years ago. What are the most weeds? And the one comment we got in the questions was how to control smooth bed straw, and we could probably spend to that. And spotted knapweed seems to be the up and coming weed in Maine. So those two invasive weeds. And again, most of those are related to management, whether that's soil fertility, soil pH management, and how that field has been managed for hay or pasture in the past. So again, when you're dealing with weeds, how to deal with it. Are you organic? Are you conventional? Do you want to use herbicides? Spotted knapweed is a problem. It creates an allelopathic effect, inhibiting the growth of desirable plants around it. Produces a lot of seed. It's a short-lived perennial or a biennial, so you need to think about how do I control those weeds. And then bed straw. And again, if you're using herbicides, make sure you read and use the label correctly. If you're using an aminopyrrolid herbicide, realize you've got a lot of warnings on there about where the hay that comes off of that goes. Where does the manure go from the animals that consume it? I can look like a genius when I walked on this farm and somebody asked, why are all these tomatoes dead? And I asked them where they got the mulch for their hay. It was from a field that had been sprayed with an aminopyrrolid herbicide. And so that carryover goes right to that garden. Weed wicks are also available for trying to control weeds with limited herbicide use. So lots of different options out there, and I'd be glad to talk to people individually if they have specific questions about certain weeds and how to deal with it. But Sam, I think I've used up more than my time, so I am going to open it up for some questions, and I kind of raced through that, but hopefully I answered a few during that talk, and maybe there'll be some more.
Great, thank you, Rick. You're doing great on time, and we have a couple of minutes here for questions. So what I am going to do right now is first I am going to try to unmute everybody. Okay, so now you should all have control to unmute yourself if you want to ask a question. So far, let me pull back up my question box. There was a question about perennial rye. I have heard that perennial rye is a great grass for the cooler Northeast. Could you comment on that?
Sure. So we've done a lot of work with perennial rye. It's a desirable plant, and obviously when you go to Netherlands or European countries that do a lot of grazing, a lot of those fields are 100% perennial rye. So it is a great grass. The issue we have had in the past is winter survival, and we've done a lot of work. Sid Bosworth and a variety of us had some trials in Vermont and Maine and New Hampshire and Pennsylvania, and obviously our stands in Vermont and in Maine were on different soils, but both of us had issues with longevity of those stands. I like to add it in. It's very competitive early on in the first few years, provides high quality forage, but just realize that it does not seem to persist in our climate.
Great, thank you. And then there were, I'll just address, there's several comments requesting the weed chart after the talk or a copy of the slides. And so I can, Rick, I have your slides, and if it's okay with you, I can post those. Also, for anyone that came in late, there will be a recording of Rick's presentation posted probably by the end of next week, and you'll get the link to that in the registration follow-up email. I don't have no other questions have come in yet. Does anybody else have a question that you want to submit in the question box?
I don't have any problem with sharing those slides.
Great. I will, we can put those on the website as well. Okay, here's another question. Oh, several came in. All right. I have lots of pokeweed. What's the best way to get rid of them?
What weed is it?
Pokeweed.
Boy, that's one that unfortunately, well, maybe fortunately, we don't seem to have much in Maine. I assume pokeweed is a broadleaf weed.
It is.
Yeah. So.
And they get pretty big.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, it depends. Obviously, pasture management and clipping probably going to be part of that. And then if you're willing to use a herbicide, realize that most herbicides are going to be either a broadleaf herbicide or a grass herbicide, or non-discriminatory herbicide like glyphosate, where we're going to be killing both broadleaves and grasses. So if you're doing broadleaf herbicide, I mean, that would be an option for you, but you also want to think about what are the grazing and harvest restrictions after you use that broadleaf herbicide. And by using that broadleaf herbicide, you're also going to eliminate a lot of the desirable broadleaves, like the clovers, alfalfas, and other legumes that potentially are in there.
Great. Yeah, and I will, and I'll just add, yeah, pokeweed, it's really a pain in the butt because it is a native plant, and even around me, some people plant them as ornamentals, and it drives me nuts. So I've had some luck on a much smaller scale having to hand pull them, because once they get really big, their root systems are just phenomenal. Okay, a bunch more questions coming in. So here's a comment. A good reminder about frost seeding is frost seeding typically takes place during maple season, freezing, thawing temperatures. That's a good point. Another question here. Do you have advice on how hard to graze under these drought conditions?
Well, that's a great question. Obviously, when you're grazing under these drought conditions, you want to leave as much residual as possible, because you want to shade that ground to try and keep it as cool as possible and minimize the plant's sloughing of the root system. So if you graze short, realize that what's above the ground tends to mimic what's below the ground. So if you graze really short, your root system's probably really short. So you're going to end up trying to create even more of a drought-stressed plant. So make sure if you're grazing under these conditions that you leave as much residual as you potentially can. Think about how you're going to do that, whether you're going to expand your pasture system, whether you're going to feed more in the barn and take them off. But really, under dry conditions, you don't want to graze short. You want to leave as much residual as you possibly can.
Great. Okay, another question. What about weeds from bale grazing? This seems like a good way to introduce weeds in addition to forage seed.
Correct. It really depends on where those bales have come from, what you've harvested. So yeah, the potential is there to introduce species from other field that you may not have had in that pasture originally. So that is an issue. So know where your bales are coming from, know what you might be putting in there. But yeah, you are correct. You potentially could be bringing in a problem if you're doing that. So be aware and know what you're doing there, especially if you're buying hay and putting those bales in there. So I've seen that happen with a variety of things, including knapweed, or I've seen knapweed come into a field through purchase feed.
Okay, Rick, I'm just gonna keep going through the questions, and even if we go over time, if you have time to stay on, I'll go through them all because they're rolling in now. So here's another question. We have had issues, more specifically not being successful with new pasture and moss taking over.
So moss is a tough one. You have moss, obviously you must have a really moist soil. It tends to be, moss likes it moist, likes it acidic. So make sure your soil pH is correct, that you're up at that 6.5 range. If you're not organic, I can tell you that using a fairly strong dose of nitrogen fertilizer, or it's going to encourage the grass and discourage the moss. I've seen that work fairly well. If you're not an organic farmer and can use nitrogen fertilizer, I would think about putting on 60 to 100 pounds of N, whether you're using urea or ammonium sulfate, potentially to really set back the moss and increase the grass growth. That would probably be one of my suggestions. There are some herbicides specifically for moss, but I'm not sure if they're labeled for hay fields. So most of them would be labeled for lawns, so I'm not sure it'd be legal to use them in a hay field or a pasture.
Another weed question. How can I get rid of a large stand of Japanese knotweed? The $1 million question.
$1 million question, and I, you know, it's one that many people have tried to answer. Obviously, it's going to be one where it's going to be either a long time period, but if it's something that you can smother, whether that's with heavy pieces of carpet remnants and try and smother it and keep it underground for a few years, it's still one of those most unbelievably persistent weeds, almost impossible to get rid of. I had an old farm and I had some in the back, and I have to admit I pulled out the glyphosate and I was pretty diligent. I sprayed that knotweed when it was 4 or 5 feet tall to try and maximize how much herbicide would be taken into the root system. I did that for 4 or 5 years and I thought I had it licked. I moved to about half a mile down the road, and I went in my old farm's backyard the other day, and I saw that it was all back again. So it's pretty persistent. It's tough to kill. You know, keep cutting it, keep mowing it, keep clipping it. Animals will graze it. So it's about all I can tell you. It's pretty hard to kill.
Yeah, and a couple of comments on that that'll roll into a question. There's the comment that that goats love knotweed, and that knotweed in hay causes nasal irritation all winter, including in the goats. Also commented that let's see, goats and sheep will eat pokeweed. I would be interested to know how much it grows back, because I found that if you don't get the whole root system out, that's one of those things that just grows back with a fervor. But then that rolls into a question, which is, I'm raising goats and sheep, first year on pasture here. I would like to know the value of weeds, proteins, etc. Where could I find that information?
So Kathy Voth from Colorado has done a lot of research on the nutrient value of certain weeds. And so if you look up Kathy Voth, V-O-T-H, she also puts out a publication called On Pasture, which is a great resource. So I would suggest getting the subscription to On Pasture. It used to be free, but now she has a subscription fee, but it's well worth it. And her name is Kathy Voth, V-O-T-H.
Awesome. And just so everybody knows, we'll try to get through all your questions. If you can't stick around for the answer, it will be recorded, so you can catch back in. Another question, we have an old concrete weight with 2-inch spikes. Is that a good way to aerate?
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of aerating because I'm not sure it really does all that much except put holes in the ground. It doesn't necessarily relieve compaction. So if your goal is to relieve compaction, that's probably not going to do it. If you're trying to create a seed bed by punching the seed into soil, it may do some of that. It's also really good for creating pockets for liquid manure. If you're applying liquid manure on those fields, for liquid manure to stay on that field and infiltrate. Realize it's not going to really relieve compaction. So I just want to make sure that's clear, that it's a difference between aerating and relieving compaction.
Great, just a couple more. I think this came in follow up to shorter grazing for, well, I don't want to make an assumption. I'll just read the question. The question is, how short is short grazing?
So obviously this time of year, if you want to leave residual, I'd like to leave, 4 to 5 inches of residual. So, and again, depending on the species that are grazing, they're all going to graze different heights. So whether you're grazing sheep, dairy cows, horses, all of them graze at different heights. And so it's really hard to say what's the best residual. But, I'm going to stick with the dairy cow synopsis and say that if you can leave 4 to 5 inches of residual in a dairy cow situation would be ideal.
Great. in tandem to that, is clipping pasture after grazing a good practice?
Yes and no. I mean, obviously, clipping is going to put all the plants in that pasture on an equal footing for regrowth. So if you have problem weeds, if you not manage the pasture correctly, and so you have a lot of residual, clipping is a way to put all those plants back into a steady or an even vegetative state. So yes, I think clipping can be desirable. Obviously, if you can manage your grazing so you don't need to clip, that would be the best. But again, clipping definitely helps, especially in terms of trying to keep back plants that are less desirable to the species of animals that you're trying to feed.
Great, and I think you might have already answered this with some other questions, but just in case the asker is still wondering, I want to mow after grazing, how short to mow?
Again, I would try and leave as much residual as possible. I wouldn't want to go more than 4 or 5 inches. Having said that, if you want to set that pasture back for a no-till seeding, then you want to really scalp that because you want to have that young seedling have a chance of getting sunlight and have some competition ability against the existing forage. So if you're mowing to put in a new no-till seeding, you want to mow really, really short. And if you are just clipping to put everything on an equal basis and clip out the weeds and the seed heads, then you want to leave some residual material.
Great. And last question for you, Rick. I've been seeing an increase in sweet vernal grass. Perhaps this is because it isn't grazed hard enough early in the season?
Sweet vernal grass is another one of those we see that really starts to predominate in a field that has low pH soils. So it's really critical to get a soil test and increase that soil pH. And I too have seen a huge increase in sweet vernal grass in the past 3 or 4 years. And it's not a desirable grass in the sense that it doesn't yield much. It's seeding, going to seed really early, not very productive. It dries up really quick. I mean, all the fields around here that haven't been mowed that have sweet vernal grass in them are completely brown right now. So again, I would start again with that soil test and make sure the soil pH is correct in your field and improving the fertility, adding some nutrients, whether that's manure or fertilizer.
Awesome. Rick, thank you so much. That was our last question. We really appreciate you presenting today. Thank you to everyone that has been here. And as I mentioned, this will be made available, and you'll get a link in the registration follow-up email where you can find the recording. And we will also work on posting Rick's slides as well. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar. And again, thanks so much, everybody. And I hope you have a great weekend.